Okay, we think we can start. Oh, right. Okay, we've got the voice. So we are now moving to the session whereby we discuss one of the topics proposed by FPR. Before doing that, let me introduce myself. I'm Stavros Malas, researcher, SRG member, the State Representative Group, former chair of the group. Had the chance also to be the Minister of Health, was chair of the Competitiveness Council in 2012 when Horizon 2020 was essentially wrapped up. It is, of course, before we go into the actual discussion, it is a great pleasure to see a very substantive discussion about IMI, because I had the fortune to be one of the first people involved in setting up IMI 10 years ago. And believe me, when the first proposition of IMI was put forward by the Director General of Health, then there was a very negative reaction by very many member states. It was thought to be a vehicle of using public money by the big pharmaceutical companies to propel their research. This is no longer the case, which is why IMI-1, I think, was a very successful incubator for changes of mind. And of course, IMI-2 is now the ecosystem for generating those synergies that we've been talking about. You do know, of course, that IMI has a special characteristic. It is a format of arranged marriages between pharmaceutical companies, group of researchers in pharmaceutical companies lending themselves to a marriage with competing academia networks. And it is the case that the formulation of the research topics comes from FPR, because at the end of the day, we need better drugs, and they are the ones who develop the better drugs. So they define the research areas that they like to collaborate with researchers to gain more knowledge in developing those drugs. What we'd like to do is discuss one proposed umbrella topic called better outcomes, big data for better outcomes. But before we go into the specifics of this one, I'd like just to remind you, and it was hinted later on by one of the last discussion points raised, that there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of fragmentation, there is a lot of gaps we need to solve in the process of innovation. There is one fundamental problem we cannot solve, and that is a big challenge, the fact that all people are very different. And they are very different, and each human being is a different experiment. When you're trying to reproduce it, it doesn't always work. So because of this difference, we have the very big challenge of looking at human beings as systems and trying to model them, as one of the speakers, or one of the attendees rather, said earlier on, to model it, to understand how that genetic variation ramifies into the biological process. And biological variation, despite the fact that it measures only 0.5% at least of our genome, it amplifies itself depending on the environment, depending on a number of other parameters. So we have that variation underpinning just about everything we're trying to do in life. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce, first of all, Magda again. Magda is representing FPR, and we will have a couple of people from industry trying to explain to us what is the concept of this big data for better outcomes. We also have here on the panel people from policy, representing a number of DGs, and they will have to say their view on that as policymakers. So I will start with Magda, that she will introduce the topic.
I don't know where should I do it. From over there?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm really glad that this session is so well attended. And just a little check, who is here from non-pharma sectors? Yes. Thank you. Great. Then I think we would have a very fruitful session. So indeed, when on the program, you could see that the session was called Big Data for Better Health. And we had, since we published the document on the IMI website, and this is a concept paper of an umbrella program, which is at a very early stage of development. We hope that we would be able to publish that sometime in September, the first calls for expression of interest under that program. So keep fingers crossed. But when we started when we published it, the first comments that came back were, is that about big data or is that about better health? Well, actually, it's the combination of the two. It is about better health. That's where we aim at, but by leveraging the potential of big data and new technologies around that. So that's why I put as a title of this presentation, Better Health Outcomes Through Big Data, rather than the original title, which was maybe not completely reflecting the focus of it and what we try to achieve. Now, what is the starting point for that program? Why did we think it was useful? Well, you would say that in IMI we have already a number of projects that look at big data, either at real-world evidence, at registries, at patient-level data. There are actually quite a few of them, but all of them are looking at these big data from the point of view of medicines development programs and how we can leverage this information in new ways of developing medicines or for safety. There was one perspective that was really missing, and that would address this aging society and impact of chronic diseases as well as efficiencies of healthcare systems. And all of that with an impact on the way we start developing medicines, we think about development programs, and this is this perspective of outcomes. So in a way, by setting this program up, we are adding to the perspective of more effective R&D and better safety, a third perspective which would help us to exploit this big data and real-world evidence potential to also improve health outcomes. In a way, this is what the program of IMI is about: reduced attrition, faster access, and better outcomes. And this is the really starting point of this program. Why outcomes? Because the variations are very big across Europe on outcomes measures. We see a lot of variations, and we also see a lot of inefficiencies in the system that could be addressed if we actually started to measure what healthcare products and healthcare services really do and how they perform. In a way, it is evolving the system from price volumes into real value and real performance, and that would also have a very big impact on the way we think about medicines development programs. The benefits of that? Well, improve outcomes, first of all, reduced variations and therefore better efficiencies in the systems, and reduced medical cost, ultimately, so improved healthcare systems as well as improved medicines development. So in order to do that, we've imagined, and remember this is just a concept for the moment, which is up for consultation, so we are very happy to take your input and to hear your views on whether these questions are relevant, whether they are appropriate, whether there is anything missing. But our first thought, and we don't know what we don't know, but the first thought was, if we can address these 4 questions, we might actually that's maybe not exactly where I want it to be, but you would actually have on your apps, you would see the question, a little poll about the relevance of the program. So if you go into the IMI app, you would see the poll, so please take it. We are curious of your views. The first question would be indeed 4 of them. The first one is, what is the outcome? What is the outcome that is meaningful, not just for the payers and for the regulators, but for the patients themselves as well? After all, this is about patients. The second question is, how do we measure that, and how do we collect and access the information in order to get there? What are the methodologies? What are the pathways? How to interconnect these different sources of information? The third one is about methodologies that would be based on this data. What are the methodologies to predict those outcomes, and how we are going to inject that into both medicines development programs as well as in discussions about healthcare systems of the future. Let's take an example of advanced therapies. Do current systems cater for that? They probably don't. And that's what we would like to look into by doing this program. And the fourth, and probably should be first question, is how we engage patients in collecting real-world evidence, in bringing that back, and what this real-world evidence would really mean in terms of making decisions at all stages of medicines development, research development and access. So these are the four questions. And what does that mean now in terms of program structure? So we thought about many projects, or several projects, many is maybe too big word, but several projects that would address one or more of these questions, and where we are going to learn from them and bring the knowledge into one place where we can integrate the knowledge and draw some conclusions. You remember that in the earlier session I was speaking about the programmatic approach. This is exactly what we try to do, is to learn across boundaries and to make sure that we can exploit, that we can set up a methodology or methodologies and learnings that can influence, that can inform the research processes as well as regulatory and medical practice ultimately. There are four areas that we are thinking of. There are many more actually, and in the paper you would find also reference to psoriasis, for example. But the four that are the most advanced in terms of therapeutic areas is Alzheimer, and you would hear from colleagues from that group in a second. Hematologic malignancies, multiple sclerosis, and cardiovascular diseases. The two first ones would probably be ready for launch in September, depending on the feedback and discussion that we would have with all of you and with the companies and with interested parties. And one project which is more technical, the European Distributed Data Network. This is really about the data interoperability, not about infrastructures, but interoperability and processes around connecting different sources of information. One project, as I've said, about the coordination and support to make sure that we integrate the learnings, that we bring all information together in one place, that we also serve the projects for horizontal questions that they may have. Take alone the personal data protection issue or other legal aspects that can be addressed in a more effective way if we look at them cross-functionally. And finally, a common data center where the information would be stored. Because this is also important. That's one of the biggest values of IMI projects, as you heard earlier today. So that's just the concept in a nutshell. In order for you to understand more in detail how it would work, what it would deliver, we've invited colleagues from Rhodes on Alzheimer's disease to actually show you more. But please remember that this is early stage, that this is consultation, and that we need your feedback. So speak up. Either today, or there is also an email address which you can use to send us your written input. But I would say today what you have to say. That would be much easier. Leave me your business card. I got already some. Happy to take more. And let's continue the dialogue. And I would like to invite colleagues from Rhodes to present a case study. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda.
Thank you, Magda, and thank you all for the opportunity to share our project idea with you today. I'm here on behalf of the Rhodes study team, and my colleague Frederick as well will be presenting some. So we wanted to give you an example of how we feel like we can make the big data project more concrete in a specific disease area. and that's in Alzheimer's disease. And so I'll give you some background to hopefully explain why we feel like this is a great opportunity and why there's such an unmet need in the disease state, not just from the perspective of developing new treatments, but as well as of finding innovative ways that we can better study the disease and understand the impact of these new treatments once they come through the pipeline. As I'm sure many of you in this room have been affected personally by the disease, either through a friend or loved one, but it's a very prevalent disease with an aging society. So in Europe, current estimates are between 6 and 7 million people affected with dementia. And that number is expected to nearly double by the year 2050. So clearly there are some significant public health implications, but also social care implications of not treating this disease and of not having new ways of slowing the progression of the disease or even preventing the disease at some point. We know also that it's a very complex disease. There have been some wonderful pre-competitive partnerships between academia and industry to understand better the pathophysiology of the disease. We know now that it starts probably decades before the actual clinical symptoms occur. And so it can be very difficult to characterize who these patients are before they even have any of the symptoms. Current treatment options are fairly limited. There are 4 different medications that are indicated for Alzheimer's disease. There are certainly supportive treatments that one can use to help the patients and family members. But again, there's a clear unmet need in the treatment of this, and so far nothing that has addressed the underlying pathology of the disease. We expect, too, that with an increase in a rise in the aging populations as well, that this becomes even more of an issue because you have a greater percentage now of the population that would be impacted by the disease. So we really feel like the IMI consortium allows ideally for this cooperation between industry, who's trying to develop these new treatments, and also the many different stakeholders that would be involved in helping us better characterize the disease, treat the disease, help manage the disease. And importantly, and I've heard this referenced a few times, and Frederick will take you through who we want to be engaged in this consortium, but importantly, we want to focus also on making sure that those payers are involved in this, the health technology assessment groups, the national payer systems that really will bear a lot of the burden of taking care of these patients in the coming decades. As I mentioned before, this is a very complex disease, which from a data standpoint means then you have to go to many different sources in order to understand who these patients are and how they progress. So certainly we know that there are certain biological changes that occur in the brain with aging. This is beyond that. There are multiple pathologies that are likely occurring and many projects that are helping understand that. But we also have to understand how the symptoms evolve over time. And now as treatments are moving not just from the dementia stage, but even in milder patients, so mild cognitive impairment or even people in preclinical stages of the disease, so they don't have symptoms at all, how do we understand them? How are we able to get data on those patients and follow them over the entire course of the disease? This is very difficult to do. The current healthcare systems, by and large, do not code very well related to even dementia, and so imagine the complexities then of trying to get them to better characterize patients that don't even have symptoms. And so what we saw was not just an unmet need in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, but also a large unmet need in how we can use data to our advantage to better understand this. And this would not be just for industry, but for other social care systems that are trying to better manage these patients, for the medical care system that's trying to better manage these patients. So there are advantages all around to using big data to our advantage to fix and help support something that's likely to have an enormous public health impact. And so with that, I will turn it over to Frederick, who will talk to you a little bit more about how we conceptualize being able to address some of these issues. We won't be able to fix it all at once, but we hope we're making a good start.
Thank you. So the end goal is really to improve the assessment and the treatment of AD Alzheimer's disease patients. How are we doing this? We're planning to build a deep understanding of how to measure outcome. But what we mean by outcome in this particular case is beyond just the clinical endpoints that we all used to see. It's really what matters most from a patient perspective, from a regulatory perspective, down to a payer perspective. Now, we cannot do this from our own drive. We need the participation and the involvement and the dialogue with stakeholders. And this is the reason why we started to have this discussion across pharmaceutical players at the moment, developing a number of innovative, emerging therapeutic approaches to actually change the course of the disease. For that purpose, what we propose is to have a two-phase approach. The first phase, which is a shorter one, is so-called a situation analysis, where what we want to do is to look at what is available. It was mentioned there's a lot of variability between the standard of care within the countries, between stakeholders, between different level of responsibilities. So we want to spend time. We want to spend enough time to put in place a dialogue between industry, academia, and regulators and payers. And we think this is going to take a minimum of 2 years, where we can set and lay out hypotheses that we want then to move into a prospective exercise, to go out and collect data to validate those outcomes. So I'll go and move forward and give you more detail on that. The expected impact, first of all, is really from the better understanding of how the disease evolves over time from what we know already, but really collecting it and containing it into a disease model is to try to see how we can potentially enable a better care for what is already existing, that is the right treatment and the right patient at the right time. There's a lot of efforts that a number of countries are taking at this point in time around Alzheimer's to try to actually better diagnose patients and also provide them a better care in the community and so on. So we need to think at a more holistic basis. But also moving forward, as mentioned earlier on, where we have a massive effort from a development perspective to bring treatments that have the potential to change the course of the disease, that is not to be just symptomatic, but potentially disease modifying, maybe in a very long future curing, but in the interim live with the disease, delay the onset of the dramatic impact of developing Alzheimer's, losing insight, losing connection with your loved ones, and then ending in an institution. With that in mind, there is going to be a lot of questions around how do we assess the value of these treatments in terms of regulatory perspective and how the value is going to translate in real life. The clinical trials are being developed cannot run forever. The data endpoints that most stakeholders always been interested is, time to institutionalization, time to onset of Alzheimer's. But if we think of changing the course of the disease, and we are earlier in this mindset, the clinical trial are really going to address the early onsets. What we also need to demonstrate is what will be the impact in much later stage in life for a disease that is really a continuum, not a time event driven, a time event or a time to event driven disease. So there's a lot of activity that's taking place already in IMI, and what we intend to do is to provide the best fit for improving value in healthcare delivery. We have already a lot of activities upstream, if you will, in understanding the disease, the target. How do we potentially be a lot more refined and sophisticated in understanding which patient will actually develop the disease at later stage. We have mentioned the clinical development efforts are already taking place. There's been a number of clinical trial failures, but still there's a strong impetus to continue developing a treatment that will change the course of the disease in this field. But then now we need to really understand what does it mean to bring a treatment that will change the course of the disease. So, as mentioned earlier, we propose two key phases. The first phase is the situation analysis, is so-called establishing this dialogue that we want to take place between industry, academia, and regulatory payer stakeholders. But we want this to we're proposing this dialogue to take place around four key themes for this to be successful, which is really to define what are the outcomes that really matters that we need to look for. There's going to be a lot of data gap in terms of real-world evidence. We're very well aware of it, but let's really agree on what matters in terms of outcome definition. How do we access data of sufficient quality across all stakeholders? Can we agree on that? How do we use this data to inform decisions? And finally, how do we make sure that we have a strong engagement from a patient perspective? And with that in mind, what we've designed is this four key stages to deliver a situation analysis at the end of a 2-year period, which in finite should really come out with a clear statement from the stakeholders we want to engage. I'm talking about health technology assessment bodies, the EMA, the payers, national health authorities, and patient involvement. Can we get something publicly available and transparent as, okay, this is the situation. Now, what we can do is to enter in a second phase, which we think might take up to another 5 years, where we want to go out and plus the gaps that we will have defined or identified in this first phase by basically developing a prospective research on real-world evidence data to, again, better inform how we provide the best treatment for patients in the future.
Thank you, Frederick. Okay, before we give the floor to our colleagues on the policy-making side, I'd like to clarify the structure of this program in case it was not clear. So there will be various research projects addressing some aspects of the research component in developing better therapies for AD. And there's also going to be a coordination and support action, which is not a research instrument. It is a coordination instrument that is going to be like an umbrella, if you like, for all these activities. So there will be money for research as well as for coordination. Can I just ask a clarification before I give the floor to our policymakers? So what you're saying essentially about the collection of large data sets using existing therapies is that some of them can work better if we had a more informed knowledge of how to use them and how to assess patients. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, the first, what you see when you look at the care for Alzheimer's, there's a lot of, again, variation in the quality of care. So from what you can collect, you should be able to already define that there are areas of improvement in terms of allocating resources and taking care of the patient pathway. I'm talking about not when it's too late, but maybe starting earlier in the treatment pathway for those.
The time of intervention, you say?
Indeed.
Okay.
That's the first step. Yes.
Okay. But really, that is the key point. The time of intervention is critical. So being able to diagnose the disease properly, I know there is some issue there, is a key issue. That's what you're...
This is a very key issue. Diagnosing the disease, what stage of the disease, and how this is going to evolve.
Okay. We'll probably come back to that. I have a provocative scientific question for you. Oof. Okay. What I like to, because on this side is the people that are formulating the ideas and the topic call. On my left and right, we've got 3 colleagues from 2 from DG, 1 from NICE. We have Terza Petsko, who is Program Officer at EU Policies and Health, DG for Communication Networks. Jérôme Boehm, who is also Policy Officer at eHealth and Health Technology Assessment at DG Health and Food Safety. And we have Nina, who is from NICE. Nice lady. Okay, so you're from the policy making side. Who wants to come in? You've heard what these people are up to. They're up to a few marriages. And from the policy-making perspective, do you want to comment, Terza, perhaps?
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting us, and thank you very much for the very good presentations and the good overview of what it is about. What I am going to say sounds more like a coordination and support action, actually, because that is what the role of European Commission often in the area of healthcare is, that we have not so much competence to regulate rather than collect information, share good practice and fund the research and therefore as well as the deployment. But there are a few points that I would like to highlight in this content, and some of them I didn't actually find in this document, but it would be perhaps good to keep in mind in case it would be materialized into the project proposals. So from the perspective of the unit where I am working in DG Connect, which is called Health and Wellbeing, of course for us the major data source, so-called big data, or maybe it's a deep data, maybe it's even a little data, but nevertheless it's all very important, is actually the electronic health record. And my colleague Jérôme perhaps later will say more in the light of the cross-border exchange of health information. But from our work point of view, of course, the most important is to make these electronic health records really workable, to really get out of this that it can offer. Because until electronic health record stays in a computer of one doctor, it is almost as good as a paper copy of it. So the fact that this data can be shared, the data is accessible while all the data protection elements are fully considered and implemented, that would be a very important input for the research purposes as well as for the treatment of an individual patient, if that would really work. So these questions of interoperability, in case questions of deployment, these are really important to keep in mind. Because if we look, for example, into the study that was done among the general practitioners and hospitals in 2012, we see that the large majority, almost 100% of doctors are using digital health records, but very little percentage of them actually share this information. So that is quite a lot to do. Then I already mentioned the data protection aspect. I think this is something that without creating a trust, we will not reach the level of this access to this information, and we don't get the maximum of this big data that we would consider. These data protection things are also addressed from the point of view of the research that we fund in DG Connect, considering that this privacy by default would be the technological solution that could facilitate all this access and use and sharing and research issues. I heard in the morning session it was mentioned, somebody said that all this data will be downloaded for the research. I think that that is something perhaps could also be considered from the data protection point of view, that not all data necessarily has to be downloaded. It can be used somewhere in an encrypted form or pseudonymized form or anonymized form for the research purpose only, and then this data will only stay in that cloud or wherever it's used, and then that's it. It will, this word downloading, that sounds a bit scary sometimes. Then, what else I want to mention, because I can't use all the 35 minutes of the time that has been left. Cooperation with partners. This is this cooperate and support action, but if you look into what is happening in other areas, you can maybe find a good links with the work which is, will be then conducted under IMI. For example, the Big Data Value Association, which is another public-private partnership created with between the European Commission and with the industry that is dealing with the big data. And the aim of it is also looking into the aspects of data collection, storage, analysis, including data protection. So I believe there is a lot to learn and to see what is happening there. With regard to the previous presentation, the example of the Alzheimer, for example, Human Brain Project. I think there is a lot in that project. It's a huge project. It's the flagship project where a lot of information can be mutually beneficial. So this type of, I believe that whoever will be funded for this coordination and support action will do a good job. And final point what I would like to mention. In this table, it is said increase patient engagement through digital solutions. I would say that that is an old-fashioned approach. Today, we talk about patient-centric approach. We don't have to increase their engagement. We have to make them the center of the universe, which we all are in our personal cases. But this, of course, requires their engagement, and this certainly requires much higher level of health literacy than we today have in among European citizens. As okay, it's not the most recent study on health literacy, but that is the only wide study in Europe that was done in 8 member states, which showed that every second citizen doesn't have sufficient knowledge of health literacy. So if we want to put these patients, to bring them in and to give them the power of managing their health and disease, because you were talking also about the early diagnosis, the first signals, all this data collection. Their participation and involvement is crucial. They have to know what for and why it is beneficial for them. So, of course, from our unit perspective, we are talking about digital health literacy. But health literacy as a principle, that is very important here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. But you will agree with me that before we give the doctors, all doctors, a computer to put the data in, some of them have a computer, they don't put the data. They need to put that data in a particular way so that these guys can extract the data, because there's tremendous variation in the input of data and they're probably not extractable. So I guess we need to, in talking about designing of standards of assessing outcome, we need to design a way for them to enter data that is normalized across Europe so that they can be used for these studies. And because I work in an institute that are looking for treating AD patients, I can tell you that we can see the problem there. Tremendous variation of how data is put into the system.
I absolutely agree, because what we see often now is that electronic health record is a collection of PDF files.
Correct.
And that is absolutely not digital approach to the electronic health record.
Right.
But it is not only that we have to have a clever people who know how to put this data collection into place. We also need to involve end users in it, to not have another failure that somebody creates a fantastic technological solution, but ordinary people, as ordinary people are, they don't really manage it, or they need another 2 months of training course. So it should be the end user involvement in it, so that the tool that is created for the purpose of treatment research, basically that it really gives maximum out of it, should be made in a way where the user is involved as well. And of course training is the compulsory point there.
Okay, so we move to Jérôme, on my right. Jérôme.
Thanks, Stavros. Do you know what's up on the agenda in Brussels in the health area? And it's about market access to treatments. Every day we receive letters from patients, from addressed to the Commission, to MEPs, saying what can you do at EU level for facilitating access to treatment. And of course this is not an EU competence, as my colleague said, but there are many things that we can do and that we are doing, and I'm going to explain what we are doing in this respect. Because market access, and sorry, I just wanted to mention that I understood that in Denmark there are some elections now, and one of the first top item on the agenda of this election is not so much immigration and employment, it's really affordability of new treatments. So in countries like that, this issue is on the top of the agenda of the politicians. So it is also on the top of our agenda. But of course the issue is not so much what we can do, but how we can facilitate the conditions for accessing treatment. So of course reward for innovation, so that we all agree, but also affordability. And so the conditions for facilitating access to treatment is basically how much can the policymakers, how much can the decision makers, the payers, make decisions which are evidence-based. And to do that you need clinical data, you need to have economic data. But at European level we are really focusing on the issue of how can we substantiate decisions on clinical data, because for sure economical challenges, societal perspectives for instance, are much more context specific, and these are issues which can really better be addressed at national level. But on clinical data, I'm going to expand a bit. So what are the challenges? So as was said by previous speakers, indeed there is a need for more clinical evidence. Now for expensive treatment, indeed, payers, so national insurance funds, but also private insurance funds, they are negotiating with industry based on managed entry agreement. And to do that, they need to have data collected through studies or collected through registries or directly stemming from electronic health records. But to do that, you need to agree on what type of clinical data you want to collect, what type of patient outcome indicator you want to focus on, what are the comparators you want to focus on. So there is really a need for data. And as mentioned also in previous session, the problem is that we are, we are overflooded by data for which we don't have the competence or the capacity to really identify to measure the quality of such data. So we've discussed a lot in these from the previous speakers, the need to focus on to collect data for the development side, but I'm going to focus mainly on the retrospective side. So again, how can we facilitate the work of those making the decision on market access? And for sure, all the colleagues in charge of health technology assessment at national level, at EU level, all the payers, and there are a number of representatives here, they are in need for real-world data. What we discussed, what was presented by the previous speaker on Alzheimer's disease, the issue is the best way to collect this data is not to work in sequence, that basically you've got a product development, you've got a regulatory process, you've got an HTA process, you've got a pricing reimbursement process. The best way that we are now testing at European level in complement to the national level is how we can engage what we call an early dialogue between all these actors, so that the data which need to be generated are also anticipated by all actors. So in the clinical development phase, mainly phase 2 or phase 3, but also in anticipation of the requirements which will be made by regulatory authority and also health technology assessment authority. So at European level, we are very much supporting these activities of early dialogue, so that there is between HTA bodies, but also with the EMA, so that there is this anticipation of the needs for clinical data to be generated. So what do we need what are the challenges we need to address? In terms of barriers to collect, I would say to collect and to reuse big data across borders, we've got a number of challenges which we are addressing at EU level through different audiences. First of all, through the so-called HT network, but also through the network of e-health competent authorities. And to do that, and at least on the e-health side, it's quite a challenging exercise, but we are moving ahead. We need to identify all the barriers which prevent exchange of clinical data across border, which means identifying the technical interoperability barriers, the semantic interoperability barriers, and I would say even more difficult, the legal interoperability barriers. But there is one thing which is not so much a legal issue, but it's the issue of trust and acceptability by all actors, so by patient, by health professional, in the willingness to collect this data, to record this data, and also to make this data available. The second big pillar challenge we need to address, but I think today there is some sign in this room that we are already tackling this issue, is the need to have I would say an integrated, I would say almost industrial policy, because so far the debate was mainly led between the Commission and the pharma industry, so notably through IMI and other research area. But I'm very happy to see that here you've got a number of actors also representing the IT industry, the medtech industry, the telecom industry. And these guys are now coming to the Commission and say, yes, we are interested, and we are interested in closing the loop in your own debate on how we can best contribute to this generation of data in the sharing of data. So that's why you've got a number of companies from TechOn which are here today. And that indeed, that could be an area of development in a future public-private partnership, so in complement to IMI or in what my colleague Thierry mentioned about this data value association. And what is true is that we have made a short mapping exercise, and the EU actors who have a broad competence on the health data, I mean, there are not so many. I mean, everybody can quote a number of American companies, but it seems that the number of EU actors which have this overall competence are not so much. And this is an issue for the EU to address, whether we should really have an industrial policy in this respect. I will close with this so far, and happy to answer your question.
Thank you, Jérôme. I was hoping that nobody will bring up this market access business. But it's a good, yes, because it is a big issue for healthcare systems, of course, lots of different parameters. Yeah. Nina.
Hi, I'm Nina Lathia from NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. And I am glad that Jérôme brought up the issue of market access, because NICE is in the business of healthcare decision making. And a large part of our remit, in fact the majority of our remit, focuses on issuing guidance for different health technologies. So we do this through our various programs, our clinical guidelines program, our health technology assessment program, our interventional procedures program, and our medtech assessment program. And up until this point, for those programs, the information that we've used to make decisions for those in those various programs has relied largely on data generated from randomized controlled trials. And so this is very exciting for us, this looking at real world data and real outcomes data, because I think one of the big challenges for our institution has been trying to model or extrapolate this, the often surrogate or intermediate outcomes, health outcomes that are reported as results of clinical trials into what Thierry would call patient-centric outcomes that are important to patients and important to decision makers as well. So we are, at our organization, we are currently in the process of developing methodologies for integrating real-world data, real-world outcomes data into our processes for issuing guidelines. And on that point, I think from our perspective, from a decision-making perspective, I think there's probably 3 key steps when you're talking about objectives or scope of a particular project, as we are in this case with the Alzheimer's project. The first would be really defining very clearly and very specifically what outcomes are important. What are the important clinical outcomes to patients? So, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, many of the clinical trials we deal with report outcomes such as results of mini mental tests that are done in physicians' offices, whereas the real data we need are things like, how long can an Alzheimer's disease patient remain in their home without having to go to assistive care, and some of the data we hope to have access through to these programs will allow us to answer questions like that. So again, just really focusing in on asking the most appropriate questions for the therapeutic area or for the disease area in which the projects focus. The second point is, I think we at NICE have realized that there is a lot of data out there. There is a ton of data out there, and we need to develop the skills and the expertise to extract and analyze the most appropriate data for the question that we're asking. And I think that's something that a lot of researchers, a lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry are just sort of coming to terms with and grasping at this moment, is really this idea of matching the most appropriate data to the outcome question that you're asking. It's so easy to get lost in the data, and I think we need to be aware of that, and we need to really focus on using the most appropriate data, defining what we in fact mean by big data in the context of assessing health outcomes, and what exactly is composed of that big data for the specific questions that we're asking. So those are sort of the research and policy implications from my perspective in terms of using big data. And the other thing that I think we can't emphasize enough, which is an operational issue that Thierry articulated very coherently at the beginning of this session, is the issue around data ownership and information governance. And although we at NICE don't deal with any individual patient-level data, we recognize that issues of data ownership and information governance can be particularly problematic if they're not dealt with at the initial stages of the project. So, who owns this data? What kind of requirements are in place to use this data? Who has access to this data? I think those are very, very pertinent questions, and although they're operational questions, they do need to be addressed at the forefront of projects such as this. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Nina. Okay, so we only have 17 minutes to go, and I'd like to engage the audience at this point. So you've heard it all, the policymakers as well as people from FBI, what they expect, at least at this stage of consultation. We'd like to hear from you, in particular, how to formulate the content, I guess, of this call. This is particularly important for the stakeholders. So who wants to go first? There is a gentleman right over there. Thank you very much.
I'm George Witter from Berlin. I'm coordinating an FP7 research program, collaborative research program, on cognitive disorders in postoperative patients, which is kind of a dementia-like clinical picture. And that brings me to the point. I like your proposal. I have carefully read the records, and I thought that could be a pretty nice project. There's only one thing that I don't like, because it's a logical inconsistency in your suggestion. You repeatedly emphasized here that you want to go into real data, right? Real world data. Alzheimer is not a real world diagnosis. That's the problem. You have so many phenocopies of Alzheimer, clinical Alzheimer. You have comorbidities that are relevant, not only vascular, metabolic, inflammatory conditions. Even in your third pre-call, it's more a preclinical call. You are looking at the interaction of inflammatory conditions with Alzheimer pathology. So I really would strongly recommend you, I mean, it's up to you, you can do whatever you want, but I would really strongly recommend you just replace the word Alzheimer by dementia. I think we don't know yet what's happening 5 years from now. If that first phase is implemented, maybe people recognize that it's perhaps easier to find a treatment for conditions like inflammation, subtle inflammation, metabolic stuff, find the right timing to start with the treatment, and just leave the amyloid plaques in the brain, if they are present at all. I mean, there are a lot of dementia people with the label Alzheimer with no amyloid in their brain and the other way around. So I would keep that open and replace the word Alzheimer by the real world word dementia. I mean, one can still do amyloid PET. That would be nice, actually. That would be very interesting to see. But I would leave it open. I mean, I just want to remind you about the study from the UK, the National Postmortem Cohort Study. There was a population-based cohort study and attached to it a postmortem database. They looked at a lot of rates of so-called Alzheimer patients. Amyloid was not so often found, but a lot of other stuff. That's what I would say.
Yes.
Manuel.
We have the lady at the front and then the gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with my colleague who had the previous remark. I am a neurologist, so we see many patients, and I would also propose not only the stratification of the patients, but to plan a structured database. If you would like to compare the different e-health records, you will find really very different text and different status from the patients. If we would like to compare an apple to an apple, we have to know how to structure this electronic health record, and if we already structured it, then we can do some kind of stratification based on this data, and we can continue how to stratificate further with genotyping or with imaging or with neuropsychological tests. For example, neuropsychological tests. You mentioned the MMSA. It's okay, but if we have a very early stage, it will not help for us. We need much more sophisticated neuropsychological tests. So I would like to recommend at the planning of the project a structured database, and we have to go. We cannot use the retrospective data, and if we would like to go crossover activities or to use the crossover activities, it is much more important, because in the different countries there are different cultures, even how to document the patient. Thank you very much.
Before we go to other questions, so not to get completely lost in the many questions, I would let colleagues then to comment on the Alzheimer versus dementia. But just on the data, I think that we are really looking at completely new operational and business models where we exploit not just real-world evidence, but big data, including healthcare data, the data that is in the healthcare systems. Some of it would not be structured, so interoperability would be absolutely key. While I don't disagree, and I think our objective is also to make sure we can exploit the data in a structured way, we, I think, need to look at how we get access to various databases, and we will never be able to bring everything under one database anyway. So how we actually we create interoperability. Does that resonate with you? Or, yes? Okay. Just to make sure that we are on the same.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so I will address the comment about this dementia and not Alzheimer's disease. So I agree. Probably most patients you see in clinic have many different pathologies happening. They have lots of comorbidities. It's probably rare to find someone who is purely Alzheimer's disease, if we can even capture that. But part of the reason for focusing on Alzheimer's disease is that, in fact, our other reality is that new treatments that come through, and again, we're from industry, they are focused on a disease. It is highly unlikely that you're going to get a new treatment that targets dementia as a broad category. So I think we would say that in general, we want to make sure that these databases are friendly to cognitive impairment generally. So you could pull in the pathology, so you could pull in the results of a PET scan, for example. And we have a couple of industry partners that are part of the imaging field, not just pharmaceutical industry. So we want to make sure that these data sets are appropriate for cognitive impairment more generally, and part of that will be Alzheimer's disease. And again, we want to make sure then that it's structured, and Alzheimer's is one way to focus and kind of test some of those additional data fields or structured data that we might want to do and to incorporate in the second stage of our project.
Yeah. Okay, we have the gentleman at the back there, and then the gentleman here at the back.
I'd like to suggest to go one step further and replace Alzheimer's disease or dementia by a real disease where we have clear criteria, where there's no discussion, where we don't have a preclinical stage that lasts for years, but where we have an early diagnosis, where we have clear therapies, so that, and where we have big data, so that instead of setting out to solve a question that requires that you solve another set of questions first, you can actually address the real question you want to resolve from the start. There are diseases that actually lend themselves to addressing the issue that you're bringing forward here, and Alzheimer's or dementia is unfortunately not amongst them. So I would say address the real question, put the other issues into another research project, because that's what you're doing. You're really proposing to do real preparatory research to finally be able to be in a position to answer the question you really want to answer. So put that on another track and proceed with a disease that lends itself much better than Alzheimer's or dementia.
Thank you. The gentleman over there. Of course, you do realize that there are three other disease areas, MS, malignancies, and cardiovascular disease. Presumably you're referring to something else. Yes? Yeah. Which disease do you refer to? Which disease do you refer to? You suggested to remove dementia. Huh? Okay.
Yeah. I have two comments about, the cause of the Alzheimer. In the company, we say that when a concept fails regularly, maybe it's false. So sometimes it's important to think that maybe a beta and tau are unspecific consequences. The second thing is about big data. We give medical sense to data, and when we start this, we want this data to be contextualized. That means where, how, and to know exactly how it's present, and then to relate it to a mechanism, and then to have something robust. If not, the work generated to do this, the value at the end is zero. So sometimes we prefer to say to the company or to the people, you throw them away, and now we start to produce this data, because when there is something interesting, we can go back and you know exactly what happened and in which context it was done. And especially if you try to input, health data. If you don't have the specificities of the devices, you can, and I guess, a monk that is thinking, the systems will say that it is dead if you don't know that it is in meditation. So this is very important to know that if you want to go back and to analyze and to try to understand, you need to control every step to be sure that the data are valid and you can rely on them.
Thank you. We have the patient organization here. The gentleman at the front.
I'm a little bit astonished. I'm looking to big data. I see a beautiful picture of research. I don't see a research design where patients are involved. That's one thing from the patients. I stop there. But I'm coming also out of genomic robotica, informatica, and biometrics. And I'm really concerned that I don't hear anyone of this environment that is just telling you that the way we are talking here, we are not looking for new, let's say, approaches to big data. Big data should be quality data. Data that we are looking in should actually coming from the real world. Well, we are getting all kinds of remarks here, and they are all colleagues, so I'm not going to bash on them because they are my colleagues from the research, but I want to have here a little bit a better view. Research on real data is actually research on data that's outside of the primary, secondary, and tertiary care. Research that we want to do on going back is actually data that we want to connect towards the knowledge that the patient is becoming a patient, but de facto, that's data that's already much further in his own thing. We're talking about on every 10 patients, only 3 patients are actually getting treatments. So, and of 5 patients in the healthcare system, 2 of them are not good there. So we need to have this triage up front of it. And if we want to do that, I didn't hear anyone talking about HL7. I didn't hear no one talking about SNOMED. There are structures that are right now talked about, and I'm sitting in one of those committees. The ICT is right now doing all of the things you're talking about here, and I'm really actually quite disappointed, really disappointed, that no one here is actually aware about that. That right now in the United States we have a lot of primary, secondary, tertiary care that are much further ahead. They already made all kinds of guidelines that are in their ICT filled in. These are the medical devices that are chopping over towards here. And I would have loved to have heard right here that we would have a remark that IMI wants to sit on one of the commissions on the HL7 commissions, that kind of questions as we're asking here. We need to have more structured possibilities that we're actually going for research, and for that we need to have structures inside of the HL7, and that are the interoperability and standardization procedures that right now are going on. And I'm sorry that I'm always talking about the big elephant no one talks about, but we are actually taken over by the industry that's called ICT. And they are much further ahead, and they are just using their structuring lining, and they are already there. Because if I fly back next week to the United States, they are having this already in place on the American way, not on the European way, so not good for researchers. And I want to have IMI looking into that, that we have people on those premia where we are talking about give possibilities for researchers. That would be my nicest question to you.
Okay, we take another question, and then I think the gentleman behind you, yes. The gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Francis Crowley from the Good Clinical Practice Alliance Europe. And I'm also on the Ethics and Legal Advisory Council to the Quick Concept project, which is an IMI project. Last week we discussed within the Quick Concept project the problem of bringing the data together. So really what I didn't hear here, I would like to hear more of. Maybe it's too simple or so, but it's really how do you collect, procure that data? How do you store it? Who has access to it? These are really important and difficult questions. And I've seen this now with the Quick Concept project. I've seen it in the past too with FP7 projects, bringing patients and researchers together. Very often a stumbling block is what happens after the project. Who's going to be responsible for this data after the project? How can we access, how can we share this after the project? And then even within the course of the project, it seems to hinder the progress of that project. So I think, and I'm looking a little bit at Mrs. Petzo there from the European Commission, because I think we need some kind of public authority involved with this as well. We need a public format, not just ethics committees, not just research institutions, public or private, but we need some kind of authority where we can have comfort and a kind of confidence in the data as it's being shared. Please.
Okay. I want to apologize to other people who wanted to come in, but I'm looking at that screen. It's only 2 minutes left, so we need to give the time to the people from FPA in particular to address some of these very, very important points that you raised.
So 3 questions. One is, where are the patients? And I would say, I'm very glad that you say so, because they are right in the center of that. This project is actually open to healthcare systems, patients, prescribers, all of those who actually make decisions and deal with the information and have to do something with this information. So I think that it's premature to say that patients aren't there, because these projects are opened right for them and to them in order to take both input and to have their participation in defining what outcomes means, deciding how to measure and what is practical from the patient's perspective, etc. So I would say your remark is probably slightly premature, but just gives us from communication point of view, I think we have some work to do in order to make it more prominent. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The question about interoperability, 100% agree. We need really to look at interoperability and bringing everyone together. I don't know whether you realize, but we are just about to change the business models from commodity-based to value-based. And no one has picked it up, but even our industry wasn't, there is quite a new thinking here, and I assume that organizations like NICE and others might actually be very happy to hear that switch, but it's completely new, and we have to evolve together, and therefore interoperability of information and sustainability of data, to the point that was made, is that this data would be in the public systems one day. You are absolutely right. It shouldn't be silos of private data sets. We need to find a place where we can actually both access and integrate new information coming into healthcare systems, and that's why we hope that these projects would attract also healthcare systems and insurance that actually store the data, and that would secure this long-term sustainability, public confidence, trust, and access. I think this is very important, and we would raise that. I think I responded to the 3 questions.
Okay. Do you want to say something?
Well, and I think so. Our project specifically would be some of the issues around legal and ethics would be part of the broader big data initiative. Yes. So we would rely on them for that as well. The patient's obviously centered to that. And then the other piece, too, is we want to consider what our other options are. So this is not a project just about electronic health records. It's not a project just about claims data. It would also be additional technologies that are available now and that are being developed, so that, again, in the second stage of this, that we would have some recommendations about appropriate technologies that we could bring in to better understand that patient journey as well. So those are not excluded, in fact, just the opposite.
Terry, you want to close? Please.
Well, I am not going to close the session, of course, but I would just like to mention 2 things. First of all, that the question of standardization and the European interoperability framework is planned to propose for the discussion at the e-health network already this year. So all these issues are ongoing and discussed, and I think that at the member state level it is not always so terribly bad that nothing is happening and nothing is said. I would say that in this context, in this session here, I thought, for example, from our point, that it's too detailed. We just mentioning importance of interoperability is the level to details we should go. And another thing that I would like to mention, the data protection regulation that is currently under the discussion with in the Council and the European Parliament and the Commission, the trialogue that is going to take place. We have foreseen in our e-health action plan 2012-2020 that following the adoption of the regulation, the guidelines as regards the e-health tools will be, we will work on it. So that's kind of next step after.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up. So it is my conclusion that probably this topic has attracted a lot of interjection and a lot of constructive suggestions. is being clearly challenged in a number of ways. And of course, I think that is going to be taken on board. There's a platform, I gather, on the website for some very important suggestions to be made, not just on the disease progression and possibly existence of phenocopies, but also on the various other aspects of interoperability of the platforms that hopefully need to be developed and accessed. So we need to close now. I want to thank everybody for a very constructive discussion, thanking the panelists, everybody from right to left. I want to really say that it's been, of course, a very constructive meeting in this one and every session, and I hope that Europe is working on such a constructive attitude at all aspects, not just in research. Thank you.